The temperature had fallen far below zero. Snow rose to the height of a grown man's knees. Wind knifed through wooden walls as if the walls were not there at all. And yet, in a medieval village of 300 souls, not one person froze to death that night. Not because they had heating, not because they owned special clothing, but because they knew something almost no one alive today has ever been forced to learn: how to survive winter with almost nothing. What you are about to see is not a list of curious facts. It is the complete system, brutal, intelligent, and often shocking, that kept entire villages alive through the longest, cruelest winters of medieval Europe. A system built over centuries, tested by the failures of generations who died before they got it right. Stay until the end, because the simplest piece of this system is the one that will disturb you most. To understand how villages survived, you first have to understand what they were surviving. Historians call the years between the 11th and 14th centuries the medieval warm period, a phase of relatively mild temperatures that allowed farming to push north across Europe. But relatively mild is a misleading phrase. Even during the kindest decades, winters between November and March could be catastrophic. Rivers froze solid. Grain badly stored turned to rot inside its own sacks. Livestock died standing up, overnight, in poorly sealed barns. And after 1315, everything grew worse. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was preceded by a run of abnormally cold winters and rainy summers that wiped harvests from the map across Western Europe. The chronicles of Jean de Joinville and the monastic records of the Abbey of Saint-Denis describe what happened inside the least prepared villages: livestock dead in the fields, families who had already eaten the seed grain saved for spring planting, and deaths that began with the very old and the very young, the two groups least able to generate their own body heat. But there were villages that came through those same years with almost no losses, not because of luck, because of method, and that method began long before the first snowflake ever fell. Surviving a medieval winter was an operation that began in summer, sometimes early summer, when the wheat was still green on the stalk. Every decision made between June and September decided whether a person would still be breathing in February. The first pillar of the system is so obvious it sounds absurd, and yet ignoring it was the mistake that emptied entire villages: firewood. In a typical medieval village in northern France, England, or the Germanic territories, firewood consumption during a single hard winter came to roughly 4 cubic meters per family, calculated from 13th century seigneurial records. 4 cubic meters of dry wood, cut at least a full year in advance so the moisture had time to leave the grain. Wet wood produced more smoke than heat, and smoke inside a low-ceilinged house killed more slowly than the cold, but just as surely. Gathering firewood was not a chore. It was a formal obligation regulated by feudal law. The Domesday Book of 1086, the great property survey commissioned by William the Conqueror, records specific wood-gathering rights across dozens of English estates. There was the right of estivers, the exact amount of wood a serf or tenant was allowed to take from the lord's forest. Take more, and you were punished. Take less, and the family simply froze. So from the beginning of summer, the men of the village walked into the forest with axes and walked back out under enormous bundles. Week after week, the work was measured, recorded, and divided. The woodpile beside each door was, quite literally, a countdown, a visible measurement of how many months of life that family had already secured, and how many they still had to earn. But wood alone saved no one. The house had to hold the heat that wood produced, and the houses medieval peasants built were far stranger and far cleverer than the pictures in most books suggest. The first thing that surprises anyone who studies medieval rural architecture is that peasant homes were not built to be beautiful. They were built for one urgent function: to trap heat. And they were extraordinarily good at it, not despite their simplicity, but because of it. The most common structure across England, France, and the Germanic territories between the 10th and 13th centuries was the longhouse, a rectangular building with a thatched roof, walls of compressed straw and clay, and a single internal partition dividing the human space from the animal space. That is correct. Livestock lived under the same roof as the family. Not because medieval peasants failed to see any difference between people and animals, but because a full-grown ox produces a truly impressive amount of body heat, the equivalent, in modern terms, of a mid-sized space heater running without pause. 3 or 4 oxen, a few goats, and a handful of pigs, sealed into an enclosed space, could raise the interior temperature of a longhouse by several degrees. On a night when the outside air dropped below -10 Celsius, that difference was the difference between waking up and not waking up. Excavations at Warham Percy, an abandoned medieval village in Yorkshire, revealed structures with clear evidence of joint occupation by humans and animals for generations. Researchers found layers of compacted dung which, beyond being valuable fertilizer, released additional heat as it decomposed. The house was warming itself from the floor up. The thatched roof did the work industrial insulation does today. Straw packed in layers 40 to 60 centimeters thick formed a barrier against cold as effective as many modern walls. The problem was maintenance. A thatched roof with a hole let in not only cold but moisture, and moisture combined with cold killed faster than cold alone. That is why, in many villages, inspecting the roof before winter was a communal obligation. The thatchers moved through the countryside in September and October, patching in silence, understanding that their needle was one of the small instruments that kept a village alive. Reconstruction studies at open-air museums like Beamish in England and the Ribe Viking Center in Denmark have shown that a single central hearth inside a 15-meter longhouse could hold the interior between 12 and 15 degrees Celsius, even with outside temperatures well below zero. 12 to 15 degrees sounds cold, but 12 to 15 degrees is the exact border between surviving and freezing. Still, no house, however cleverly built, could do the job alone. The body itself had to fight. Medieval peasants understood their own bodies as instruments. They knew, without needing any modern language for it, that heat was something a person carried and could lose. The first strategy was the oldest and the strongest: layers. Against the skin, a rough linen shirt. Over it, a wool tunic. Over the tunic, a cloak of heavier wool, often rubbed with animal fat to shed the wet. On the legs, wool stockings bound with leather strips. On the feet, boots layered with hide and lined inside with dry straw, the most accessible insulator on earth, replaced the moment it grew damp. Hands were the impossible problem. Bare fingers in freezing work freeze within minutes. So peasants wore mittens, no divisions between the fingers, because fingers held together retain heat better than fingers apart. When the work demanded precision that mittens could not allow, a man worked in bursts. Task, hand into the chest. Task, hand into the cloak. But there was another strategy, quieter and stranger, that the sources returned to again and again: deliberate collective warming. On the coldest nights, families gathered into a single room, not just the nuclear family, sometimes 2 or 3 families together, grandparents, adult children, grandchildren, sometimes neighbors. 10 people in a small room produce heat close to a modern space heater, and when there was not enough fuel to keep every hearth in the village lit, concentrating human bodies in fewer rooms was a solution that cost nothing but pride. William Langland, the English poet, described these scenes in his 14th-century Piers Plowman. Poor families crowded around a single fire, sharing not only warmth, but whatever food they still had. The image is not one of passive misery. It is one of an active survival ritual, repeated in thousands of houses across the continent, night after night, for centuries. Even the animals were part of it. Large dogs slept beside people, not for affection alone, for warmth. Monastic chronicles from 12th-century northern English abbeys admit that even in religious communities with strict rules about the separation of species, the practice of allowing dogs into the dormitories during the harshest winters was quietly tolerated by the prior. The body could burn well, but it needed fuel, and that fuel had its own story. There is a direct, mechanical relationship between food and body temperature, one that medieval people understood in practice long before science described it. Eating more keeps the body warmer. Metabolism, in processing food, produces heat. A person with a full stomach endures cold better than a hungry one. That made the winter food supply as urgent as the woodpile, and it began at the harvest. In September and October, the fields emptied in the most intense weeks of the agricultural year. Grain was threshed, cleaned, and stored in raised granaries, raised so that rats could not enter and air could circulate to prevent mold. Storage was so critical that many villages had a specific official responsible for inspecting the communal granary. In Middle English, he was called the hayward, a word that survives to this day as a surname. Root vegetables were buried. Turnips, carrots, parsnips, the cold-resistant roots that formed the foundation of the peasant winter diet, went into shallow pits covered with straw, where they stayed edible for months. The smell they gave off when they began to spoil was a warning system more reliable than any calendar. The reserves were running out ahead of schedule. Meat was another matter. Most domestic animals not needed for spring work or breeding were slaughtered in autumn, especially in November, once the air was cold enough to preserve the flesh. The Feast of St. Martin, on November 11th, was linked across medieval Europe to the beginning of the autumn slaughter. Meat was salted, smoked, or simply hung outside, where the temperature itself became the refrigerator. Salt was one of the most valuable commodities in the medieval economy for exactly this reason. It made it possible to eat protein through the entire winter without depending on hunting or fishing, both nearly impossible under snow. Tax records show that the salt trade, the gabelle in France, was one of the most consistent sources of revenue for medieval rulers. To tax salt was to tax survival, and every king who taxed it knew it. Beer and mead were also part of the strategy, not as luxuries but as calories. Medieval beer was thick, nutritious, low enough in alcohol to be drunk during the day without impairment. A jug of it delivered calories close to a small meal. When solid food ran short, beer stepped in. Water, by contrast, was dangerous in winter. Wells froze, contamination killed. Fermented drinks, having passed through a process that neutralized many pathogens, were simply safer, and the monks who brewed the finest of them knew it with complete clarity. Wood, walls, bodies, food, every pillar built and stacked, and yet none of them would have held for long without one final piece, the one that was, in truth, the invisible foundation of everything else. A medieval village was not a collection of isolated families who happened to live near each other. It was an organism. And in winter, that organism operated at a level of coordination that many modern institutions would struggle to match. The concept of mutual aid did not need a name in the Middle Ages. It was simply what you did. A family whose roof collapsed under snow the night before would find neighbors at the door in the morning, tools in hand, straw already gathered. Not because anyone had been summoned, but because the informal system of obligations demanded it. Today I help you. Tomorrow you help me. And winter is long enough that everyone needs everyone else at least once. The English manorial court rolls preserve real cases of disputes over these obligations. Families accused of failing their neighbors. Counter-accusations. Arbiters appointed by the Lord to settle them. The system was real, structured, and taken seriously. The parish acted as a second layer. The local priest, who knew every family in his congregation by name, who had reserves and who did not, served as an informal redistribution point. Donations to the church's granary were turned back into aid for the most vulnerable during the hardest weeks. This was not random charity. It was a social function, expected of the ecclesiastical institution and enforced by community memory. Craft guilds carried the same logic. The Winchester Weavers' Guild Charter of the 12th century includes clauses on support for members who fell ill or were incapacitated during winter, ensuring their families received help while the member could not work. This was not mercy. This was a collective insurance policy, and everyone involved understood it as one. Even the work itself served a hidden function. Winter tasks, repairing tools, working leather, spinning wool, kept people warm because they kept people moving. A person who stops moving in the cold enters hypothermia faster than one who does not. Women in particular held the winter economy together. Spinning and weaving were almost exclusively female work in the rural context, and they happened mainly in the months when the fields demanded no one outside. A woman spinning for hours beside the hearth generated body heat, produced cloth, and kept the room occupied, which mattered psychologically as much as it mattered physically. But this collective survival had a hidden clock built into it, and that clock was religious. Here is something almost no one considers when they think of the medieval church. The religious calendar was, in large part, an agrarian survival calendar in liturgical disguise. The feast days of the saints were not chosen at random. Over centuries they were calibrated, quietly, precisely, to the practical needs of European rural life. St. Martin, November 11th, the start of the autumn slaughter, and the last date for bringing livestock home from outside pastures. Not a coincidence, a synchronization. St. Thomas, December 21st, the winter solstice. In many regions, this date was the marker of midwinter, not the beginning but the checkpoint at which firewood and food had to be measured. If stocks had not reached the halfway mark by St. Thomas's Day, the village had a quiet, serious problem. Candlemas, February 2nd, 40 days after Christmas. This feast marked the point at which winter reserves were in their most dangerous phase. The food gathered in September was thin now. The animals were worn from months without green pasture. The cold went on, and spring was still weeks away. A medieval saying, preserved in many regional forms, warned of exactly this. At Candlemas, half done or nearly gone, meaning the hay stored for livestock. That saying was not folklore. It was a stock management guide embedded in cultural memory. The Lenten fast, 40 days before Easter, fell in February and March. It had religious justification, but its practical effect was that the entire community consumed less food, precisely when there was less food to consume. Religious fasting made it acceptable, even virtuous, to do what necessity was going to force anyway. We cannot say with certainty that medieval churchmen sat down and consciously designed the liturgical calendar as a tool of agrarian survival. But we can say, with full confidence, that the result was functionally exactly that. Generations lived inside a system where the rhythm of faith and the rhythm of survival almost never contradicted each other. By now you probably think the secret of medieval villages was preparation, architecture, calories, and community. That is true. But there is one more element historians have identified only recently, and it changes how the whole system looks. What kept medieval villages alive through the most brutal winters was not any single strategy in isolation. It was the speed at which the village identified who was in danger and reacted. The historians Zvi Razi and Richard Smith, who studied the parish records of Halesowen in medieval England with unusual depth, found something quiet and important. Winter deaths almost never happened at the peak of the cold. They happened at the edges. At the very beginning of winter, when families who had underestimated their preparation were caught off guard. Or at the very end, in February and March, when reserves ran out before spring arrived. The heart of winter, January, when the cold was at its most extreme, produced relatively few deaths in villages that had entered autumn well prepared. The real killer was not the cold, it was the miscalculation, and the villages that survived best were the ones whose systems, formal or informal, detected miscalculations before they turned fatal. The priest visiting the sick knew who had food and who did not. The neighbor arriving to repair a roof saw the state of the room. The woman at the communal well heard, from other women, what was happening inside their houses. The information network of the medieval village was dense, intrusive, and absolutely effective, not because people were saintly, but because everyone knew that a collapsing family could become a source of disease, despair, and instability for the whole village. Collective surveillance was collective survival. But no system is perfect, and history preserves, with painful clarity, the moments when this one was pushed past its limit. The winter of 1309 to 1310 was recorded by chroniclers across Europe as one of the most intense of the 14th century. The Thames froze in London, thick enough for the famous frost fairs. Visually impressive and quietly terrifying, it meant temperatures had fallen far outside the range the agrarian system had been calibrated to handle. The problem that year was not preparation, it was duration. A winter that stretched past March, exhausted stores, calculated to end at March. Livestock that had survived on stored hay began to die in April, when the hay ran out and the pastures had not yet grown back. Long winter, dead livestock, no draft animals, no plowing in spring, reduced harvest, next winter, with insufficient reserves. A downward spiral medieval villages feared more than any single storm. Matthew Paris, the monk chronicler of St. Albans, described exactly this pattern. Villages that had survived normal winters for decades, collapsing over 2 or 3 consecutive years of abnormal cold. They had not lost their knowledge. They had lost their margin. And then, the winter of 1363. 15 years after the Black Death had erased between a third and half of the population of Western Europe. Picture a village in Kent. Call it Oldsworth, a name that appears in medieval records of the period. A now vanished settlement whose archaeological remains were excavated in the 20th century. In September of 1362, Oldsworth had perhaps 80 families, less than half of what it had before 1347. The fields once worked by 300 were now worked by fewer than 100, and many of them too young or too old to bear the weight. The granaries were less full than they should have been, because there were fewer hands to work the land and fewer draft animals to pull the plow. In November, the cold arrived earlier and harder than anyone alive there had ever seen. The snow that fell in the second week did not fully melt until February. Firewood stocks that should have lasted began to run low in December. The parish priest, a man called Thomas in the Canterbury records, did what the system commanded. He redistributed. Families with reserves were pressed with the moral authority of the church and the social weight of the community to share. But the winter of 1363 was not a normal winter. In January, the temperature dropped below any point in living memory. The River Medway froze whole for the first time in decades. Animals that had survived until then began to die not from hunger, but from cold. And then the thing the whole village system had been designed to prevent happened anyway. A family that had hidden the true state of its reserves, out of fear of being forced to share the little it still had, was found by Father Thomas in a state of severe hypothermia. 3 children, 2 adults. The fire had gone out 2 days earlier. They had never gone out to ask for help. The Canterbury Parish Register, preserved at Canterbury Cathedral and studied by the historian Christopher Dyer, records what came next, with an administrative coldness more disturbing than any dramatization. Buried in the parish, in the year of our Lord 1363, 5 members of the family of illegible name, killed by the cold, 5 people, in a village of 80 families, the most vulnerable, the least willing to ask, the ones the system had failed to see in time. The winter did not kill the children of Oldsworth. The silence did. The temptation, at the end of a story like this, is to reach for some grand lesson about the past and the present. But what the study of medieval villages and their winters really reveals is something more specific and more useful than any philosophy. The villages that survived the cruelest medieval winters had no advanced technology, no central heating, no refrigerators, no supermarkets. They had preparation, organization, community information systems, and the willingness to depend on one another, not as an act of generosity, but as a recognized survival strategy. The Domesday Book of 1086 records properties, the court rolls of the 13th century record disputes, the monastic chronicles record events. But what all of those documents together record, when read through the lens of winter, is a system of collective survival that functioned for centuries. Imperfect, sometimes cruel, sometimes failing at the margins, but effective enough that in the vast majority of winters, the vast majority of people made it to spring, and spring always came. That is what stood behind the medieval villages that never froze, or almost never. It was not magic, but it was not superhuman endurance. It was a system built over centuries, tested by winters that forgave nothing. And now a question for you, having watched to the end. If you had to survive a medieval winter, no modern heating, no supermarket, no internet to look up what to do, which of these would break you first? Stockpiling supplies, building the right shelter, depending on your neighbors, or the silence that killed the family in Oldsworth? Tell us in the comments. If this story surprised you in any way, drop a like. It helps the channel reach more people who love real history, unfiltered. And if you are not subscribed yet, the button is right there. In the next video, you will find out how medieval doctors treated the sicknesses the cold brought with it, and why some of their methods were far more effective than they first appear. See you then.